This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you a History of the Banned and Restricted List video for the first time in almost 2 years. People have been asking for a continuation of this series for a long time, but because we got all the way through 2019 with parts 1 through 28, I wanted to wait a few years before we continued the series with 2020. So that we would have at least a couple of years of perspective before we dove into the topic, and now that it's 2022, I think enough time has passed. For all 4 Wednesdays this May, there will be a History of the Banned and Restricted List video. This means that deck histories won't be coming out this month, but we'll return to that series for Wednesdays next month. If you aren't already familiar with this series, in it, I take a look at cards that got banned or restricted within a particular time frame and discuss why those cards got banned or restricted. If you want to catch up on the first 28 parts of this series before diving into this video, you should see a card pop up with the playlist in the upper right corner of this video. So in the last video of this series, I talked about the bans in the Pioneer format that had recently been created and several Throne of Eldraine and Modern Horizons cards that got banned or restricted in multiple formats, with Oko Thief of Crowns the biggest offender of them all. In general, we saw that 2019 was a very active year for bans and restrictions, and we're going to see the same sort of thing happening in 2020. After all, I was able to divide the year into 4 videos that are all 10 minutes or longer. In this particular video, we're going to take a look at the cards that got banned and restricted between January and May of 2020. One thing to keep in mind is that when I discuss a particular card that got banned for the first time in its history, I look ahead in time and talk about the future bans and unbannings, and for that reason, we won't be touching again on cards that got banned in 2019. For example, the aforementioned Oko did get banned in Modern in January of 2020, but we already discussed that banning in the last video, so we're not going to do it again here. Also, we only focus on formats that have Premier level events. This includes Standard, Modern, Legacy, Vintage, Pioneer, Historic, and Pauper. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into the cards that got banned for the first time in January of 2020. There were 2 such cards in the January announcement, and they both got banned in Modern: Mox Opal and Microsynth Lattice. Interestingly, these were not bannings of new cards. Both of these cards had been in Modern as long as the format had existed, but some new cards are still what led to each of these cards getting banned. Let's dive in first with a look at Mox Opal. As I mentioned, Mox Opal had been legal in Modern since the format was created in 2011, and it had been a key card in artifact-heavy decks like Affinity. However, Modern Horizons 2 had introduced Urza Lord High Artificer, a powerful card that loves artifacts. He makes a construct creature token when he enters with power and toughness equal to each artifact you control. He turns your artifacts into mana, and he has a powerful mana sink ability. He was able to produce tons of mana and created all kinds of powerful value combos. Mox Opal was problematic here because it accelerated how quickly you could get Urza into play, and with very little downside. The deck was loaded up with a ton of artifacts, almost making it feel like a Mox from the Power 9. Getting rid of Mox Opal slowed these decks down to the point where they were still competitive, but they aren't quite as busted as they were in late 2019 and early 2020. So overall, this banning was successful, though it did have some collateral damage in that it severely weakened other artifact decks in the format, something Affinity players still aren't particularly happy about. So yeah, Mox Opal was a key card in Modern for almost a decade before getting axed. Microsynth Lattice? Not so much. In fact, it hadn't ever been featured in a Modern deck that did well at any event for the first 8 years of the format, and it hadn't really been featured in any other decks in any other formats either. But then in 2019, something changed. Karn the Great Creator was printed in War of the Spark. Karn comes with a static ability that completely shuts down the activated abilities of opposing artifacts. If you combined Microsynth Lattice with that would mean they couldn't use the activated abilities of any cards in play, including their lands. This is a pretty sweet combo, but it was way too consistent because the Great Creator also happens to come with a -2 ability that lets you grab a card out of your sideboard, and the plan was generally to grab the Lattice and lock the opponent out of the game. So yeah, it is a 2-card combo, but you really only need to get Karn the Great Creator in play to get it going. Karn could even use his +1 to destroy lands once they were all artifacts. This combo was especially devastating in decks like Tron and Amulet Titan, which could very easily generate the mana needed to cast the Lattice early. In short, this combo was incredibly difficult to break, very easy to assemble, and also completely miserable to play against. In the end, the Lattice got banned, so this wouldn't be possible in Modern anymore. That does it for the January announcement. Let's move ahead to March now, where one card received a ban for the first time, and it was Underworld Breach in Legacy. Underworld Breach was printed in Theros Beyond Death, which was released on January 24th, 2020, and it got banned in Legacy on March 9th, 2020. So what made this card so good that it was only legal for about 6 weeks in Legacy? Well, it's probably fairly obvious, since Underworld Breach bears some pretty serious similarities to Yawgmoth's Will, a card that got banned and restricted in a whole bunch of formats back in 1999, and when they revealed this card during preview, most people were shocked it existed because it seemed so busted, and ultimately the community was right. It was too good for some formats. Basically, it lets you cast your entire graveyard. Now, it is more balanced than Yawgmoth's Will in some ways. For one thing, you do have to cast the card using the escape mechanic, which in this case means you have to exile 3 cards from your graveyard, in addition to paying the mana cost to cast them. But it also only costs 2 mana, and decks in Legacy were adept enough at loading up their graveyard that this card wasn't that hard to abuse. You could combine it with Lion's Eye Diamond to produce a bunch of mana while also loading the graveyard. Then cast the diamond again using escape to produce more mana so you could just keep casting stuff. You could then brain freeze yourself for more fuel and keep getting the diamond back until you had a high enough storm count for a lethal brain freeze that you point at your opponent. So yeah, it was one of the most busted decks Legacy has ever seen, so it makes sense that they banned the card after a brief 6 weeks of dominance. In August of 2020, Underworld Breach also got banned in Pioneer, where it worked in a similar fashion. While Pioneer didn't have something quite as busted as Lion's Eye Diamond, it did have Lotus Field and lots of cheap ways to untap it so you could keep making mana to cast things from your graveyard. It also had a ton of spells that loaded the graveyard in the first place that you could just keep casting until you had mostly milled yourself out. And then you could cast Thassa's Oracle to win the game when your library got small enough. This was surprisingly consistent, just like the Legacy combo, so it makes sense that it had to be banned there too. So that was the March announcement in 2020. In April of 2020, a new set came out, Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths, and one of the cool things in the set was the new companion mechanic. This mechanic allowed you to have a specific creature card in your sideboard, put in a special zone, at the beginning of each game, provided you met some deck building requirement. You could cast this card directly from this zone if you met the requirement, so you would effectively get an 8th card in your opening hand, and one that was usually one of the best cards in your deck. When these cards were revealed, it seemed, for the most part, like the deck building requirements would be hefty enough that they would balance themselves out. But it did not play out that way. It is notable that Lutri here was immediately banned in singleton formats like Commander the moment it was revealed during preview season, but that's because the requirement was automatic in singleton formats. But companion cards getting banned didn't end there. Like we saw with Underworld Breach, 2 of these new cards got banned not long after the set released. Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths came out on April 17th, 2020, and 2 companions were banned about a month later, on May 18th. These 2 companions were Lurrus of the Dream Den and Zirda, the Dawn Waker. Both got banned in Legacy, and Lurrus got banned in Vintage too, something that doesn't happen very often. Let's take a look at Lurrus first. So, Lurrus's requirement was that all the permanents in your deck had to be 2 mana or less. That is a pretty big deck building requirement in a lot of formats, but it isn't that hard to make it happen in either Legacy or Vintage. So, in those formats, you could pay a very low cost for an 8th card in your opening hand that's a 3 mana 3/2 with lifelink that also lets you cast a permanent with a mana value 2 or less from your graveyard every turn, and because of the companion requirement, that means you can cast any of your permanent spells from your graveyard once a turn. This was a pretty great deal for low-to-the-ground aggro decks in Legacy, and really any other deck that could meet the requirement. Lurrus got particularly absurd with something like Black Lotus in Vintage, so it had kind of a similar problem to Underworld Breach. You could do some absurd things with super cheap cards that produced mana. As I noted, it also got entirely banned in Vintage, and that's unusual because normally cards only get restricted in Vintage, which means you can only play a single copy of it. This didn't make sense with Lurrus because if it was restricted, you could still have it as a companion. So it was outright banned in Vintage, alongside its ban in Legacy. In short, the cost of having Lurrus as your companion wasn't very high, and at the same time, Lurrus happened to be incredibly powerful. Now, let's look at Zirda, who got banned in Legacy in the same announcement. Zirda definitely has a more challenging deck building requirement than Lurrus does, since every single permanent in your deck has to have an activated ability, and this requirement didn't make it quite as format warping as Lurrus, which many decks could pretty easily slot in as a companion. But there was a super consistent combo with Lutri and Grim Monolith. Lutri reduced the cost of untapping the monolith to 2 mana, and this would mean that you could tap it for 3 and use 2 of that mana to untap the monolith, netting a mana every single time so you can generate however much mana you wanted. And you could do this very easily, as the monolith would come down on turn 2 at the latest, and then Lutri would come down on turn 3 at the latest, and because it was a companion, you could play it after you played the monolith in every single game if you wanted to. So Zirda got banned in Legacy to make this infinite mana combo go away. While that is the last banned and restricted announcement for this particular video, it isn't the end of the story of companions. While these bans got rid of 2 of the more heinous offenders around, it turned out that pretty much all the other companions were too good too, and about half of decks in all formats started running one of these Ikoria companions because the card advantage and power of the cards was almost universally worth a deck building requirement. It also didn't help that it was busted and limited, making the Ikoria limited format kind of awful, since if you didn't get a companion, you were at a huge disadvantage. Because multiple cards with this mechanic were breaking multiple formats at once, Wizards of the Coast had to do something they very rarely do. They issued a power level errata on June 1st of 2020, and they did it for the entire mechanic. The alternative would be banning almost every card with companion in multiple formats, and they decided against that. So a month after Lurrus and Zirda had gotten banned, the companion rule was rewritten. Now you had to pay 3 mana to put a companion into your hand from outside the game. This made all of them much slower, and made them vulnerable to discard effects. This largely balanced them. So much so that Lurrus got unbanned in Vintage in 2021. However, even with the nerf to the companion mechanic, Lurrus would prove to be a little too good for multiple formats, so it remained banned in Legacy, and just last month it got banned in both Modern and Pioneer. But in the end, Lurrus in Legacy, Modern, and Pioneer, and Zirda in Legacy are the only companions that have stayed on the ban list in any format, so overall, rewriting the companion rule seems to have worked. There are still companion decks around, but they feel far more fair. So, that does it for this edition of the History of the Banned and Restricted list. Next week, in part 30, we'll take a look at June and July of 2020. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of this series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the other 28 parts of this series, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you enjoy my content and you want to give back, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.